Good morning, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of tips and tricks for complex issues. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this week. I know we had a last-minute reschedule. We are recording today's session, so we'll be made available as soon as we can get that out there for you. I'll also share the PowerPoint presentation with everybody as well. Probably within the next day or so, you'll see that come out. All right, so today, part 2, we are going to focus on receipts, receiving, invoice, and then we're going to talk a little bit about additional training options that are available for D365. So I'm going to be doing most of the talking today. However, we do have Kyle Nowak, who created this wonderful slide deck for us, joining today, as well as Brandy Pumford, the Assistant Director. They're going to help me address any questions that maybe arise during the presentation that I'm not able to answer myself. And so we'll go ahead and jump right in. So with purchase orders, the first thing that we want to talk about, first issue we want to talk about is city contact information not displaying on the PO confirmation. And so we want to make sure that users understand essentially how this works. So in creating a direct purchase order, on the purchase order itself, there are actually two fields. There's an orderer field and there's a requester field. And so when you start your order, that orderer field will populate with your information. You might be the orderer, but someone else is actually requesting it. And so there's a second field called requester, which I'll show on the next screen, that we want to remind users should always be. So there's a couple variations though. So if you're creating a PO that's been generated from a PR, for whatever reason, D365 auto-populates that requester field, right? So that requester field can be updated if you're doing a non-catalog order, or if it is a catalog order, that PO requester, obviously we don't touch that due to the nature of the process. So the primary reason that we see information not displaying on the PO is our non-catalog orders, right? And this requester field not being completed. So there are a couple areas that you can actually populate that requester field. One is when you go to create that new PO, and that sub-menu kind of comes up on the right-hand side of the screen. That field is there, and you can fill it out. If you forget, you can also get to it from the PO header. So we have a couple screenshots for you. So the top is when you're creating that new purchase order, and again, that sub-menu comes up on the right-hand side. Scroll all the way down to just before you hit OK. In this example, you'll see that Kyle created this PO, so the orderer field automatically populated with his name, but the requester field is currently blank. So this is the field that causes information to appear on a PO confirmation. So if you're leaving this field blank, then the information on the PO is also blank. And obviously, we want to get as much information to our users, to our vendors as possible. So please fill out the requester either when you start the PO, or if you forget, again, on the header view of the PO under setup, again, you'll see that order name of Kyle, and then you'll see the requester field is right below it. You can put yourself if that's correct, or you can add the person who's actually requesting this particular purchase. So here's an example of our PO confirmation that's sent via email to our vendors. Obviously, you can see the contact information is blank. This is never what we want to be sending to our vendors. And again, this comes from the requester field. So the second example, obviously the requester has been populated. So you'll get the city user's name, email address, and phone number, which obviously are very important to vendors if they're trying to get a hold of us here at the city. All right, so the second thing that we wanted to stress to users that tends to cause a few issues, users change fields or remove lines on a PO that specifically was created from a PR. And what this leads to is erroneous or duplicate accounting entries, most times against a referenced GVR. So it's really important to note that if the purchase order was created from a purchase requisition and references a GVR, you cannot change the vendor account. You should not be changing things like unit price, and quantity, and above all, do not delete lines. So deleting of lines downstream ultimately leads to that's kind of stuck, and we have to go through a number of steps in the background to kind of unstick, if you will, that PO and get it taken care of. So really the proper way, if you get from your PR to your PO and for some reason you discover at that point that the vendor account is wrong, or the unit price or quantity are wrong, really the correct process for that is that we should go ahead and cancel that PO and create a replacement PO for that. And in many cases, obviously, that may mean that a GBR needs to be reestablished. But correcting it up front versus trying to correct it on the back end is going to save you time as well as us. So, this is really important to understand. Changing the vendor account will really, whatever the amount of your PO, it will really, the amount of your GBR, when you change the vendor account, it will take that amount away from your GBR again, almost as if you've done two different POs. And obviously that's not what you were looking for. A couple of notes on travel as well, making sure that your travel purchase orders get through as quickly as possible and efficiently. So the main issues we see here are that incorrect main accounts or missing documentation. So just note that all purchase orders for travel must reference an approved BRTE. For registration, that main account is 6970. For travel, that main account is 63965. And so your BRT packet should be attached to a PO with all the supporting documentation necessary to get that approved, right? And so what do we mean by, supporting documentation? What should be attached? If we're looking at registration, you want to make sure that your documentation includes, what the registration fee is, confirmation that you are in fact registered, and then also proof of payment. And for your travel documentation, you want to make sure that you include lodging and transportation receipts. So if you can make sure that all of that is when you're submitting, then obviously that's going to expedite the approval. And so there are a few special requests outside of travel that must be accompanied by a memo from your department director. A good example of that is international travel. And so I would refer you back to the city travel policy that will outline exactly what you need to do. This is a link, and again, I'm going to share this presentation. So, you can simply click this link if you need to look at that policy. Another item that we're seeing a lot more of lately is incorrectly selected unit of measures. And this is causing issues when we go to invoice. So you always want to ensure that you're setting up purchase orders with a proper unit of measure and that you're considering how you will be invoiced, right? That's very important. So to avoid downstream issues during invoicing, make sure you're selecting a proper unit of measure. And so an example, some unit of measures have no decimal precision, right? So that means we're invoicing or will be invoiced in whole number quantities. So an example of that is a bag, a box, a day, month, or week. And obviously, if we select a bag as our unit of measure, at least to me, we would be expecting to be invoiced we're not going to be invoiced for 1.25 bags. And so another consideration, if you're selecting month as your unit of measure, you're indicating that you're expecting to be invoiced for a full month at a time, not, for example, 1.33 months, right? And if this is not how you expect to be invoiced, then you might consider switching your unit of measure to a week or a day as appropriate. And to give an example, I mean, we see things across the board. I mean, we just had something that was a quantity of 71,225 years. And I doubt that is exactly what the user was anticipating. So it is really important to understand for any documents, right, that you need to consider the downstream impact. So when you're setting up your PO, it's really critical to stop and think about how you'll be invoiced and make sure that the way you set up your PO will allow for that. Any questions up to this point, Kyle?
Nope, we do not have anything in the chat right now.
Perfect.
You must
Thank you.
explain much better than I do.
They're just holding them all. It's okay. So then we want to talk about some of the most common rejection reasons that we see for purchase orders, and so that this can allow you to help avoid these. So one of the most predominant is obviously an incorrect reason code. And so in this case, the auditor team will reject that particular PO back to you and indicate that you need to correct your reason code. Well, what we see a lot is that they correct the reason code and then they just hit resubmit. Unfortunately, just hitting resubmit, you've already got a certain way through the particular workflow. It just returns it to the auditors and it skips that additional review. Maybe it needed to go to the attorney's office, maybe it needed to go to procurement. And since you just selected resubmit, it goes right back to the auditors and then you hear from them again, right? So to avoid that, if you get a PO returned to you for an incorrect reason code, you want to recall that workflow. You want to correct your reason code and then resubmit. And what that does is it allows the workflow to start over from the beginning, and it makes sure that it's going to hit all of the approvers that needed to see this particular PO. So that will save definitely some time. A second common rejection reason is incorrect matching policy. So we want to remind you that materials and supplies, which are object class 02, are a three-way matching policy. Services, which is object class 03, is a two-way matching policy. And so I want to stress that POs will be rejected. If you change something that is identified in 365 as a three-way match policy to a two-way, that's going to get rejected back to you. Also, if you use an incorrect object class for your type of purchase, that's going to get rejected back to you as well. So again, 02 is for material and supplies, 03 is for survey. So the next one we have here says bid and RFQ information not linked to a PO. So if you deal with purchasing, you've probably had a time or two that for a variety of reasons, you had to end up doing a direct PO, even though you did an RFQ, maybe the wrong vendor got awarded, maybe there was some type of other issue that occurred, but you've been asked to do a direct PO because the normal path you would go down is no longer an option, right? So what we want to stress is that that RFQ number, the original RFQ number that you did, should always be referenced in the line detail text field, right? So that it appears on that PO confirmation. That's kind of the visual link, if you will, and also to the pricing that was included on that RFQ. So a lot of the times if the auditors that they're going to return that for you or to you and ask you to enter that information in. Again, all of these are just ways to save time, right? Validate them first before submitting, and then hopefully you can avoid the rejection from the auditor's office during their review. And the last thing on this page, at least, we see a lot of expired BWC and liability insurance certificates. So make sure that you're attaching those to the PO and make sure they're actually valid before submitting your PO. All right, so the next common rejection reason is an incorrect main account used. So you do want to ensure that you're selecting an accurate main account, and you may not be aware that users can go to general ledger, chart of accounts, account menu, and then main accounts to get a list. And they'll be able to go, obviously you can't change anything, but you have the ability to view these main accounts and look through and find the proper main account for your particular purchase. And then also something that I'm not sure that all users are aware of, accounts that start with a 6.2 are goods, and accounts that start with a 6.3 are services. And so that second number is really your object class as well, right? So 02 for goods and materials and 03 for services. So that's kind of just a quick shortcut. If you know that you're doing something for services, you can simply search for the main accounts that start with 6.3.
Hey, Cheryl.
Yeah.
Just on this, we did have a question in relation to two-way match versus three-way match. If a user creates a purchase order and changes from a two-way match to a three-way match for one reason or the other, Can they explain in the PO comments area why they're doing that, or is it necessary for them to explain why they're going from 2 to 3-way?
So I do think it would be good to note it, and there is no issue with changing a 2-way to a 3-way, because basically changing from a 2-way to a 3-way means that you're going to require the fee entered in, and then the system's matching policies will take effect as well. So that's not a bad thing, right? It's only bad when you're switching a 3-way to a 2-way. But I do think that adding the additional note upon submittal is always good. The more information you can give the auditors, the better it is, right? So that they have a reference as to why something was done. All right, so we'll continue on. So we have a note here about.
Sorry, Cheryl, I was on mute there. There's one more question that came in, and I just want to, and it's more of a clarification from procurement. So to be clear with changing information on the purchase order, that involves a purchase requisition and a general budget reservation. There may be a reason, or there may be a business reason where quantity might get changed on a PO, or may need to be changed on a PO. Again, if it starts with a PR and it references a GBR, that's where we need to follow what Cheryl covered and cancel the PO and set up a replacement. If it does not reference a general budget reservation, I would say let's maybe check via tech desk before you would maybe make that change. If it's the procurement team, guys, you have a little more experience with it, so you're maybe more aware of that. But everyone else, maybe check with us just to make sure that we're not creating those duplicate accounting entries. Is that fair, Cheryl?
Yeah, and I mean, really the big consideration here is if you've started with a purchase rec and you've used a GBR, your money's already been pre-encumbered, right? So when you just go change things, that's where the issues occur. So yes, that is the predominant scenario for sure.
Okay, those were the two questions. So, sorry.
Great, thank you. Okay, so another common rejection reason has to do with service. So object class 03 purchase orders require a service contract. So there's not a specific dollar threshold that determines whether a contract is required. So it doesn't have to be greater than 5,000 or greater than 10,000, right? That threshold does not exist. So one way to avoid, obviously, having your purchase order rejected back to you is just to make sure that you attach that contract to your purchase order before submitting. And then just a reminder, as all of us know, purchase orders should be confirmed and funds encumbered before expenses are incurred. In general, invoices are not acceptable justification. Now, we all know that from time to time this may happen for one reason or another. So if that does happen, a memo attached by your, signed, I'm sorry, by your designated or by your director's signature. Let me start over. A memo must be attached and may require a director's signature. So the memo should ultimately explain why the expense was incurred without a purchase order. But obviously, rule of thumb, city code, we all need to have confirmed purchase orders with funds encumbered before those expenses are actually incurred. All right, my next favorite one. So canceling purchase orders. So we have users who incorrectly cancel purchase orders, which ultimately kind of creates a delay and some rework. So it's really critical to note that you cannot have any outstanding product receipts when you go to cancel your purchase order. So this is the gotcha for a lot of users, right? The user does not correct or cancel any product receipts with an outstanding quantity before processing the purchase order for requisition. And if you don't do this step, then you ultimately end up having to get it back to a confirmed state so that you can do that and then resubmit. So, these are definitely things, if you're canceling purchase orders, to make sure that you're aware of. So some of the common things we see, outside of the product receipt issue, the user actually doesn't cancel the delivery remainder before submitting to workflow. They don't select the proper reason code, which is the PO_CNC LAUD before submitting, or the user process, but then they end up leaving the PO in draft and they never submit it to workflow. So those are kind of some things to be aware of. Partial cancellations. Please be aware that if you cancel only one line of a multi-line PO, your budget does not immediately become available for use, and that's because the system doesn't automatically finalize an individual line. The system does have a process that runs nightly when you cancel an entire purchase order, that it will finalize that PO, and then that money, assuming it's current year, of course, returns to your budget. So those are things to be aware of. And I had intended to put a link here to the job aids that we've created for canceling POs, and I see that I forgot that. So when I send this out, I'll make sure that that link is included also. Canceling POs is something that some of us do throughout the year. Others of us are only doing it at the end of the year, which means it's something we do once a year. So it is really good to follow that particular processing guide. It will save you a lot of time to make sure that you're doing these, making sure that you're doing the things properly before submitting. Any questions, Kyle, before I move on to receiving?
Nope. Oh, I'm sorry. One did just come in here. It says, when I'm attempting to add a requester to a direct PO and the name I want to add is not listed, I get an error message, unable to find unique worker record corresponding to entered value. How can I add the requester's name? Am I doing? I will, we can keep going. I'll follow up on that question and see if we're, what's going on with that, so we can move forward.
Yeah, one thing that I should note, the requester does need to be a 365 user. So if they're not a 365 user, then obviously, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to add them as a requester. And then otherwise, Kyle, I'll let you follow up. It could just be a searching, what to search on or how to search.
Yep.
Okay. The next thing that we want to talk about is incorrect. And many of you know this is probably one of my biggest pet peeves. So the issue is that receivers create a receipt receiving the entire quantity for a PO and all PO lines when the full amount was not actually received. So I cannot stress enough that receivers should ensure that they are entering accurate receipts. If a quantity of 12 was ordered, but only 8 were delivered, a receipt should be entered for 8, not 12. And we see this day in and day out. And it does, unfortunately, lead to a lot of extra work, not only for, people within the departments and the divisions, but also for the auditors team and the 365 team. It can lead to errors downstream as well. So incorrect receipts are often, identified when a PO is canceled and then require correction or cancellation. And on the previous screen, we just talked about the fact how many users forget to look for those receipts, and then they start the process, and then they've got to backtrack and, redo, get the PO back to a confirmed status, then fix the receipt, then proceed forward, right? So, this is this is a big deal. It does lead to a lot of extra work downstream, and so entering accurately is certainly the way to go. Incorrect receipts often lead to a receipt being applied incorrectly to an invoice using unintended quantity. And so often this requires a secondary PO to be created. Again, this is added work, right? So unfortunately what happens, this receipt for 12 was created instead of 8. They accidentally apply that entire receipt to the particular invoice using unintended quantity, and then in order to fix it, we ultimately need a secondary quantity. Once you use quantity on a PO, there is no way to restore it. That's just unfortunately how it works. There's no way to fix that. You've used it, and so a secondary PO is required. So departments, please stress the importance of properly entered receipts to your receivers. When we go to cancel POs at the end of the year, Receipts are the number one thing that get in the way. We have to go back and correct receipts or cancel receipts that were entered, and then we have receipts that were entered and then the invoice was never used or never submitted, and we're canceling the PO. So it is a really important piece to make sure that this is done properly. So then let's talk a bit about product receipts on two-way match service PO. So we have a unique issue here where users create receipts against, that should say PO lines, I apologize, against PO lines that are two-way match inconsistently. So the first several times that they invoice, they create a receipt. Then they invoice without a receipt, which the system allows them to do because the line is a two-way. And this results in incorrect invoice remainders. So what I want to stress that creating product receipts against a two-way match purchase order line for service is not really best practice, and it's not required by the system. And the reason for that is when it's two-way match, D365 doesn't enforce the matching policy. So it's going to let you enter a receipt. You know, there's no stops in the system from that. It's going to let you do it. And then if the next time that you invoice you don't do it, you therefore are now inconsistent, and it kind of throws that PO into disarray. And so that's really the problem with it. The same doesn't exist for our three-way match, which is, you know, physical materials, because the system enforces that policy. And so it will say, hey, you have to have a receipt each and every time. So when a receipt is created and not matched to a product receipt after having previously been invoiced using a product receipt, it creates what's called a negative invoice remainder. And although we've tried to find a suitable workaround for this, in probably 9 out of 10 cases, it ends up with the purchase order needing to be canceled and replaced. So again, this is added work, especially for you guys, right? Because you've got to go reestablish a new PO. Oftentimes that involves a GBR, and so it's best just to, you know, make sure you're considering these approaches as you're entering in receipts. So I do have an example here, just to give you an idea. So this PO was created for a quantity of 2,400. A product receipt was created for the entire PO quantity amount, right, which may or may not have been correct in this situation. However, the invoices were created and used product receipts for only $959.12. You can see that in the invoiced column in the middle of the screen. And then another invoice was created without a product receipt for $53.69, and now you've got an invoice remainder of negative $53.69. The system again allowed it because it's two-way, so it says, hey, you know, we're going to let you do this. At this point, that invoice, or you can no longer invoice against this PO until we can get it fixed. And typically, like I said, we're not able to get that fully fixed, and it results in a canceled PO. Sorry, just grabbing a drink there. Okay, so let's talk about three-way match POs. So a common issue that we get at the tech desk is that the user's trying to create a product receipt, but they don't see any PO lines when they go to create that receipt. So important to note that product receipts are all about quantity versus price, right? So product receipt creation is based on the ordered quantity. So users are typically going to see a message like this in the middle bottom of the screen here. When they go to create their product receipt, it says current quantity is set to product receipt quantity. The recommended value is ordered quantity. Do you want to apply the recommended value? Users are always going to select yes. So if you select no, and this is what we see a lot, if you select no, then obviously you can see in this first red box here that the quantity is indicated as product receipt quantity, and at the bottom there's nothing, there's no lines showing. So if you do accidentally select no, you get to the screen, go ahead and update this first box under the parameters to ordered quantity, and then you'll see your lines populate at the bottom of the screen. All right, and a couple notes on the ability to view product receipts. So the product receipt journal.
Hey,
Yeah.
Cheryl, on this, if could you go back maybe 2 slides real quick? So this here, if you receive product receipts, and when you go to create a new product receipt, if you do not see this screen anymore, please send us a tech desk ticket, because we can kind of reset something on the back end of your profile that will allow this to pop up for you. So if you don't see this and you're creating product receipts and this submenu is not popped up, you may have selected do not tell me again, and it's not coming up. So it's easier to click yes here. If that's something you want, send us a tech test ticket and we can get this to repopulate for you guys. Sorry, Cheryl.
No worries. Yeah, I was going to say, otherwise, when you get to the screen, you would just make sure you selected ordered quantity underneath that quantity field, and you'd be good to go either way. Any other questions, Kyle?
No, not at this time.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how to view these product receipts. So product receipt journals, users can view details about receipts that have already been generated. So this product receipt journal, if you're on your PO, you'll select invoice at the top. There will be a journal submenu that will then say product receipt. So that is one way to get to it, where you're going to just specifically see the product receipt journal for the PO that you're working on. And so obviously the overall tab here gives a summary of all receipts that were created against the PO. And then if you select line, which is to the right of overview, that's going to give you detailed information about the product receipt at the line level. So it's going to give you the specific line level or line number that you received again, what that quantity was, and so forth. And then my favorite, this was not available in 2012, this is something that was introduced with 365, is called the invoice receipts inquiry. And so this is available under the accounts receivable module, under inquiries and reports, and then you'll see a menu option called invoice receipts. This particular report is actually going to match invoices and product receipts to a purchase order at the line level. So one of the issues that we always had in 2012, especially when trying to troubleshoot issues with receiving, is that we couldn't tell what receipt was applied against what invoice. And so this report kind of brings all of that together. Important to note, you can only run it for one PO at a time, which I think in most cases is just fine. And it's going to give you the specific line number, it's going to give you the invoice number, it's going to tell you the specific receipt number that was applied against it. Again, that's the part we couldn't get before. And then it's going to tell you the receipt quantity and the invoice quantity. And so that's important because that's where we catch a lot of times where a user has inadvertently applied the entire receipt quantity, but actually invoiced for something else. So so this can be helpful, especially for, I know some POs have tons of receipts entered against them. If you find yourself in a situation where you need to do some analysis on that, I would most certainly go to this particular report. All right, so another issue that we often see is that users remove lines from an invoice rather than using match product receipts when there are multiple open product receipts. So this is specifically for invoices that are three-way match. And so the way the system behaves is that by default, all invoice lines that will be included, and they'll combine all open, not invoice product receipts when you create your invoice. Important to note that it is not recommended to remove lines from the invoice. Rather than removing lines from the invoice, you need to use the match product receipts functionality. And so at the top here, you can see the default for product receipt. And then to the left of that, there's an option called match product receipt. So rather than just removing lines from your invoice, when we're dealing with a three-way with receipts, match product receipt is the correct option. And so on my next screen here, I have a screenshot of that match product receipt functionality. And so at the bottom, I can see that I've got 2 receipts entered against line 10, which is highlighted at the top for paper clips. One product receipt is for a quantity of 1, another product receipt is for a quantity of 29. So if I get an invoice that is billing me for a quantity of 30, then obviously I'm going to leave both of these check marked, just as highlighted below. But if my invoice comes in, I get an invoice for a quantity of 29, I want to make sure that I uncheck this first line here where I have the product quantity of 1. If I don't, it's going to try to apply all 30 to this particular invoice. And I think what happens is people apply the invoice and then they apply the receipt here or don't realize they're applied here. And then they try to change the number on the front page of the actual invoice details themselves. And they ultimately end up using product receipt quantity of 30 when they only invoice 29. And that leads to issues, downstream for sure, especially when you try to do your subsequent invoicing. So again, recommendation is don't just delete those lines, go to this match product receipts, and you'll have, greater success there than when removing those lines. Any questions or comments on product receipts?
Yeah, Cheryl, there was one question, and the question was, can you view who created a product receipt? So we did not have a slide in here for who, how you view this report for who creates the product receipt. I did respond in the text with the report that shows that. And that is a slide that we'll just add to this report. It's very easy for you to see who creates the product receipt. It links it to the purchase order, and then as well as the product receipt itself. So we'll add that slide in there.
Perfect. Thank you.
So everyone else can see that as well. There is one other question that just came in product receipt. Is there a way to see the actual product and not just the category? And I believe that this is related to when we're creating the product receipt, Cheryl. This is the inquiry that I think we've had this previously, where when we go down to those line details, it doesn't actually have an item description. They're either looking at the category or they're looking at the line number to try to correspond what should or should not be received. And I think that answer is that we cannot get that item name in there or that product name in there based off of when we're doing this, but certainly we can look in there. But I believe that's a common inquiry that we had dating back to last year with product receipts.
Yeah, we'll double, like Kyle said, we'll double check, but if memory serves me correct, we were trying to add it to the list grid itself, so to the lines in the bottom of this image that's showing right now. Unfortunately, that was impossible. You can get the information below, but obviously then you have to click on each line. So I understand that is, not desired, but I do not think that we were successful at getting into the grid. We'll double check on that though. All right, anything else, or should I move on to invoicing?
There is one question about that has to come back to the units of measure. If you want to address now, or we can wait till the end, your call.
Let's try it now.
So basically the question was, is if, let's say we order a case of paint. So if we do this, I believe this may be through the catalog. So we order it through the catalog and the unit of measure is a case, but then the invoice comes in and it's by individual quantity or an individual can itself. So it's like partial, it is a partial case. It's not a full case. The user is asking if they should request a new invoice based on how the PO was created, since we're going to have that kind of hard no partial unit of measure on, or no partial unit on some units of measure.
So like a case was 12 and they only got 6 and they invoiced them differently?
Correct.
Well, that's a great question. I guess I would need to talk with purchasing about that. Yeah, can you make a note of that one? I guess I will have to follow up on that one.
Yep, will do.
You guys stumped me. All right. Okay, so let's talk about invoicing next. So, you know, obviously it's called tips and tricks, right? I think a lot of the information in the invoice area is more just sharing or sharing a refresher on what the requirements are for invoices. So I don't know if I have as many tips and tricks for you in this area, but I do think this is really important information. I will say that the invoicing area is an area where we are seeing significant increases in either invoices that are not being done properly and needing to be returned, or invoices that ultimately stop in workflow. And so some of you are probably getting emails from Jody or myself as we're reviewing stopped workflows and asking you to fix something and resubmit it. So, you know, really want to stress the importance of validation of your invoices before submitting, and then of course making sure that you have all the required information for the auditors as well. So where we're going to start is with the invoice attachment requirements, and we want to make sure that, you know, our invoices are number one, legible, that they include the vendor name or the DBA that's listed on the W-9. Obviously, they need to have a remit address, an invoice date, an invoice number, the quantity, and the total dollar amount. So the image should also include information that clearly displays the service period, if that's applicable, you know, and what was actually received, right? So in essence, a complete invoice, all the same things that we would expect to receive if we got an invoice in our personal life, right? I'm not paying if you don't tell me what it was for. So that's the first thing. Second thing, remit address and the amount being paid must either be circled or highlighted on the first page of the image. So some of these invoices that come in are really, really big, right? And so we want to make it easy for the auditors to find and be able to approve and just expedite things. So having that on the first page is quite helpful. If you do have a credit memo notation, please make sure that you're making that on the first page as well. And then a note that statements are not accepted as an invoice image unless you seek pre-approval by the auditor's office. So in general, statements not accepted, we're expecting the invoices. And then wanted to remind users that in D365, we do have a really cool option. I use it all the time, and I don't even invoice it. You know, obviously I'm not invoicing all day long, but I use it when I pay mine. So when you're attaching a document to an invoice, you want to toggle the default attachment, which is highlighted in green in the center. You want to toggle that to yes. And so marking that attachment as default allows users to see the attachment side by side with the invoice detail that's entered into 365. And so I have an example here. This one happens to be for Nationwide Children's Hospital. I see my invoice clearly on the right-hand side of the screen. You can cut and paste right out of that invoice. So what I typically do is just highlight my invoice number on the PDF that's been attached here. I highlight it and then copy that into the number field. It does have the ability, you can see there's 100% in the middle here, so you can increase the size of that or decrease the size of it. I literally cut and paste out the information into my invoice, and not only does it save time, but it also helps me validate, right? When I'm looking up that remit address and I pull up the little drop down and it shows me the addresses, I can see the remit address clearly to the right, and I just pick it list and then populate my invoice. So I think that this is something that a number of users are using, but we still see a lot of users who are not. I just implore you to give it a try. I find it really beneficial. And then the other thing that's really cool is that if you've done this at the invoice level and you know, for submittal and it gets approved and posted, when you go to look something up in the invoice journal, you're actually going to be able to see that display immediately. So you're looking it up in the invoice journal, there's something that you want to check, I don't even have to open that particular document or the details or go to lines. I don't have to do any of that. I've got my attachment right on the right-hand side that I can immediately see and reference any particular information. So I think this is a really neat feature in 365. You know, so give it a try. I think that you'll find it beneficial, just like I did. All right. So one issue that we do frequently see are invoices that are stopped in workflow due to what's called over or under delivery errors. And so essentially what this means is that a user, you know, invoiced a quantity of 25, for example, when there were only a quantity of 20 remaining on the PO line. And, you know, it'd be great if Microsoft, if D365 would catch this when you submit the invoice. Unfortunately, it doesn't. What it does do is stop it at the posting level. So it'll get all the way through workflow, and then we'll see it on our end with stopped workflow. We notify you via email that you need to go in and review and correct it, but then you've got to start your process all over again, right? So again, added work. It's going back through your reviewers again. You know, it's just it's something that is fairly easy to avoid. And so the way that I would recommend to avoid that is, first of all, when you do your invoice, the quantity remaining will populate in your invoice. So if it says 20 and you change it to 25, that's your first indication something is not really going to work here, right? Because it's going to populate with the amount, with the quantity that remains. And if you're overwriting that to a higher number, you know, more than likely your invoice is going to see some issues downstream. So the way to verify remaining quantity on your purchase order is to go to the purchase order itself, click on the General tab at the top. You'll see a little sub-menu called Related Information, and then an option called Line Quantity. And if you're not using this page now, you should be, right? If you are invoicing day in and day out, this is a page that you should be familiar with. This particular page gives you a lot of information. So obviously on this one, I can see my line number, my product name for this one, and then the original quantity of 25. And then I've got all these other fields here. So let's talk about what those mean. So invoice remainder, that's the quantity that's been received but not yet invoiced. So in this particular case, I've received 22. I've not invoiced those 22 yet. Delivery remainder is the quantity available to be received. Delivery remainder is the fourth from the right. So I can see that we have 3, so 22 and 3 equals 25, right? We're balancing. The ordered quantity is the quantity available to invoice if you're not receiving. So if it's a two-way invoice, right, we're not receiving, we're not doing receipts. We talked about that earlier. So you'll look at this ordered column and you'll see that it says 3 as well, right? So we're still in balance here. And then really important to note, I don't think that maybe all users are aware of this. POs are relieved based on quantity, not dollar amount, right? So we're relieving a PO based on this quantity of 25. It doesn't matter if it's a $3,000 PO or a $3 million PO, whatever is in this quantity field, that is how a PO is relieved. So we've had some users who've accidentally used up their entire quantity, but only paid part of an invoice, right? Or part of the original amount of the PO. Obviously not what they intended, but they used up the entire quantity. Once they use up the quantity of a PO, it becomes finalized. There's nothing that we can do to reverse that. And ultimately you end up creating another PO in order to be able to pay the remainder of your invoices. So always keep that in mind, you know, that when you think about relieving a PO, that it really has everything to do with the quantity and really nothing to do with the dollar amount. All right, Kyle, any questions before I proceed?
There was, I think this is back to the attachments for the invoice, and it was, is there any way to make it default to the attachment? So I believe that's just marking it default side by side, and the answer, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we cannot make it default to that.
You mean this one right here? This is default attachment?
Correct.
No, unfortunately you can't. And I think the reason for that is that, you could have 10 different attachments for your invoice, right? So if this was defaulted to yes, then 10 of them would get set as default, versus the one that you really want, which is the core, invoice, not the supporting information. So I think that's why. So no, unfortunately that one we can't change to yes. Anything else?
That's it for now.
Okay. All right. So then this page in particular is just, designed, before submitting your invoice to workflow for approval and payment. It's kind of a little bit of a checklist, right? And if you don't have a checklist, maybe, for your department, I encourage you maybe to try to make one, right? Use this as a starting point. Obviously, you want to make sure that your image is attached. We want to make sure that the invoice total matches the circled amount on the image. There's a lot of times that they don't match, right? And that's a problem. Vendor name and remit to address match what's on the image as well. Invoice description is populated. So, towards the end of last year, moving into this first quarter, there was some guidance that we needed to put either 22 if it was an FY22 expenditure, or 23 if it was an FY23 expenditure at the front of this description. And unfortunately, like a lot of users are just leaving the invoice description blank now. They're not adding anything beyond that, or in some cases not adding anything at all. We do want that invoice description to be populated because that shows up on the warrants that go to our vendor. And so in addition to obviously the invoice number that's given to them, the invoice description is also pertinent detail for them in matching up our payments, right? So that's why that's important. Obviously validate your financial dimension strings for completeness. Make sure that you don't have matching errors. We have a number of times where the invoice will clearly show the matching column as failed, but the user still submits it to workflow. So if it's a failed, when you go to submit, it's going to make its way back to you. And then the last thing is to validate your invoice dates as well. So something else that all individuals who are invoicing should be doing is monitoring your pending invoices. You can filter for your username and the user group and the invoice group, if you will, so that you can kind of see where your invoices are in the process. I think many of you are doing this, but if you're not, this is something that you definitely should be taking a look at. So first and foremost, we want you to review invoices with a rejected status. Invoices will move to open invoices once they're approved and posted. So as long as you see them in the pending vendor invoice screen, they're somewhere in the review process, right? It is saying in review, and we're going to show you next how to get more detail for that. But certainly anything with a rejected status, you want to be taking a further look at that. So just real quick, invoice statuses, pending obviously is an invoice that has been drafted but not yet posted. Anything with an invoice status of open means it's posted and it's ready to be paid. And then we have our pending invoice workflow status, and this is probably where you'll be monitoring the most. So obviously an invoice that has been created but not submitted will show draft. An invoice that has been submitted and pending approval, and that's through every step of approval, will say in review. Anything that has been submitted and rejected by an approver will show rejected, and then ultimately approved. You've attained all the necessary approvals, but we're waiting on it being posted. So that's just kind of a quick reference slide for you. And then if you do have a invoice workflow that's been rejected, how do you get to the details that you want to see, right? So at the top of your invoice, even if you're in the grid, you don't necessarily have to open the invoice itself. Just select the line of the invoice that's been rejected, and you can see that in the big red circle at the bottom, or square at the bottom. At the top, you'll select workflow, and then you'll select workflow history. And with the last update that we had for D365, there's now a workflow history that pops up on the right-hand side of the screen and gives you kind of like we call it a submenu, I guess, with approver details. You can also see if it's been rejected and then that person who rejected it entered comments. You can also see that as well. So in this example towards the bottom, you can see this was rejected by, and then there's a comment below that says the invoice amount numbers are transposed, right? So you don't have to go any further than this in order to see why something was rejected. Obviously, then you can go fix it and then resubmit it. At the top, there is a workflow ID, kind of on the right-hand side, right below, on this line right below where it says workflow history. That is how you get back to our old or normal view of workflow, what we were used to before this last version. And so if you need to do some additional investigation or want to review workflow in more depth, you can click on that particular ID, and that will bring you to this particular screen right here. So under tracking details, you can see every step, right? You can see every step that the particular invoice has gone through. You can still get to the same information. So right here it says rejected, and then invoice amount numbers are transposed, right? So it's either way, you can get to the same information. This particular screen just has all the detail, more specific detail, if you will. All right. So some of the most common reasons invoices are rejected. So missing required information. So you've not done an attachment, you forgot to enter an invoice date, you didn't enter an invoice description, and one that we see daily, so please validate. Invoices are submitted with no lines for $0. And we truly do see this every day. So again, that's why we're just stressing validation, because it's, you know, in the end, it's going to save you a lot of time and allow us to get things approved much quicker and therefore get your vendors paid much quicker as well. Sometimes we see incorrect required information. So the invoice date is entered in wrong, or the quantity or the net amount doesn't match what you have attached. Again, that's where I like to, you know, set that default attachment, because then I can see the total side by side. So I can do a validation before I submit. Maybe the invoice number is different than the attachment. And at the bottom, it's bolded because I think it happens frequently. The remittance address doesn't match your attached invoice either. So those are all things to look out for. And then some miscellaneous items. So if an invoice is greater than 90 days old, it does need a memo stating that, you know, this is current, this is an actual invoice you need to pay, and make sure to attach that memo to the invoice before you submit. The invoice attachment has to be legible, right? We have to be able to read it. So if you give us a non-legible attachment, that's probably going to get routed back to you. So if you can reach out to your vendor and get a little bit better quality or attach a better image quality, you know, that's definitely helpful. Invoice attachments should have information, all information on page 1 or 2. Kind of mentioned this earlier as well. An example is some of our construction service invoices. Those can be, you know, quite long. And so we don't want the auditors digging through 70 pages of invoice, right? If you can do even a cover sheet, or if there's an appropriate page to make the page that has all that information, so that the auditors can, you know, easily audit that information, it just will expedite your approvals as well. And then in rare cases, you know, if there's any corrections that need to be made by a user to an invoice and it's not ever going to match what you were given, or, you know, whatever the case might be, give an explanation, right? Write it on the attachment, put it in the notes when you submit your invoice. You need to communicate that information to the auditors, and that just helps with avoiding delays. All right, some miscellaneous items or things that we see. So batch invoicing, so paying multiple invoices under one invoice number. For the most part, that is prohibited. There are a few limited instances where this occurs, and you have to have approval by the auditor's office. So, you know, if you haven't talked to the auditor's office, don't even try to submit it, right? Because it's just going to route right to you. A huge one that we see the invoice date cannot be greater than posting date, right? So in some cases, we'll get an invoice date of 3/29, which hasn't occurred yet, and a posting date of today. Well, you can't really post something that you haven't really received yet, right? So the dates need to make sense. That one, unfortunately, right now does not stop when you submit your invoice. It stops in the back end. So that's where you start to see emails from myself or from Jody telling you to fix it. So if you just do a double check on those before you submit them, you won't have to hear from us as much. Okay, another thing to check is just to make sure that your method of payment is correct. Some vendors do have options for both warrant and ACH. You just want to double check that you are selecting appropriately. And then a note for utility bills such as phone, make sure you're paying the current amount due versus the total amount due. That's something that the auditors will look for as well. All right, so this particular screen is for invoice approvers. It looks really ugly, but it's really not. So I just want to explain it. So obviously, at the end of every month, we have a number of invoices that are going through workflow that maybe aren't through workflow at the end of the month, right? And so ultimately, the posting date just needs to be updated on those. But many of us who are reviewing invoices don't. I hesitate to say that, don't necessarily open the invoice. Maybe all the information we need to see is in our list grid. And so you'll get an error similar to the very top error that we're seeing here. And so this line doesn't really tell us much. I don't really understand it. Over on the right-hand side, there's actually like a little drop-down caret. It's cut off the screen here. Whenever you see that drop-down caret, that means that the system has more to show you. So if you click on it, then you'll see the second error message screen that I have here. And at the very bottom, that's the information we need, right? A budget check cannot be performed. The fiscal period with the accounting date is not open. So when we went from February to March, right? February was closed, March was open. This particular invoice still has a February date. It's throwing this error. All you have to do is click to open the invoice, and it will present this particular message at the bottom to you that says the posting date falls into a closed or an on-hold fiscal period. Do you want to update it? If you say yes, these messages will go away, right? And you'll be able to approve and you'll be able to move on. That's all it is. So these scary messages here, which are overly scary, are really just to say, hey, the posting date needs to be updated. And if you open the invoice, then you'll be allowed to do that. All right, so some of this I'm just reiterating. Why will my invoice not post payment? So some common reasons: the invoice wasn't submitted. The invoice was rejected in workflow by the auditor's office and it's waiting for you to correct it. The workflow may have auto-rejected the invoice because you had a matched variance error. The invoice line is for more than the available quantity of the purchase order, so that's the over-under delivery. Sort of that we talked about. The end user should never overwrite the pre-populated quantity with a higher quantity. And the reason we say never and it's bold and it's underlined is, again, it's not going to make it through, right? If it comes back and says you only have 20 left and you try to enter 25, it's going to get stopped, right? So that's why we stress that. Invoice date greater than posting date, we just talked about that. And then one that we've been seeing a lot lately is for direct invoices. When you're using an ACDI or a BRDI, you're exceeding the available GBR balance. And so that will let you submit because until an invoice is posted, you may have available budget, right? But if you're submitting invoices that are going to throw it over budget, your first two are going to post, and then by the time it gets to your third, it's going to throw an error because you no longer have available balance. So make sure that you're looking at that GBR and understanding, there is a summary page, a financial summary page in the GBR that will tell you, what you've used, how much you have left. You can break it down by line in order to see that. And so that will just help from it getting stuck. Ultimately, in that case, it has to be recalled. You have to put another GBR number or another GBR line number in there, and then it has to go through the whole submittal process again. So, really most of what we've covered today is all about just how to reduce that time, right? You want to touch it once and not have to touch it again unless it's for a value. So there's a lot of things that you can avoid or make sure that you're doing validate up front so that you don't have to touch that invoice again. All right. Before I talk about training, Kyle, is there any other questions that I can answer or hopefully answer that?
So there was one more question about workflow, and it's if you are accidentally recall or cancel a workflow before you see the history, is there any way to go back and see it once that workflow has been disassociated from the document?
Let's see. So I know that we definitely can. Kyle, we just take a note that we can check that. I'm almost positive users have the ability to go into workflow history and see all of their old documents, but I would want to confirm that, and then we can share instructions.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe you're correct with that as well.
Okay. Yep, we can certainly share directions then. Any other questions?
No, that was it for now.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, I'm sorry. There was, where can I find the summary page to read the GBR lines?
Thought I saw that pop up, so go look real quick. All right. Try to find a current one. I'm just randomly selecting, so we'll go with that. Okay. All right. So I'm inside of my general budget reservation. At the top, there's an option called Manage, and then Summary. I don't know if it's, yeah, I picked one. Yeah, I picked one that's been fully relieved. So on this financial management summary, you can see the original reservations in the first column. You can see the relieving. Ultimately, you'd be able to see how much was remaining, right? So if all of this but $50 had been used for line 10, you would see $50 in this particular column. The other option that's available is the relief details. So relief details will give you more specific information. In this case, it's what's been posted, and you'll be able to see the full list of all the invoices in this case that it's been posted against. So you can do a total at the bottom. You could also see what was open, so what's pending. That would show. Obviously, this is blank for this because there's, you know, it's been fully used. But if anything was pending, you would see it here also. The other thing that I do like is that if you want to look at a specific reservation line to see what's been posted, that is an option as well. And then it will filter out and show you just the invoices that post or the appropriate document, right? BRPO. It will show you the POs that posted against this particular general budget reservation. All right, let's see. So the next thing I just want to talk about briefly is D365 training resources. So there are a couple of changes coming. One actually already started about 2 weeks ago. Many of you who were here when we migrated to 365, you know that everyone was assigned mandatory training before we went into, before we opened D365 for youth. Since that time, though, the approach that we had taken was to provide the user account for D365 and provide a link of, hey, here's where you can go get training. And we did not explicitly assign that training to users in the learning system. That has not worked well. Most users did not watch the training or fully watch the training. And so in an effort to make sure that everybody is at least getting a solid baseline for D365, those trainings for new users are now going to be required. So for any new user that you have, they will be assigned whatever relevant training in the city's learning management system. They will have to take that training and show their certificate from the system to us before we will enable the D365 account. We just want to ensure that, you know, again, people get a base level. If you are someone who is relatively new to the city and you did not take that training, I highly, highly encourage you to go out to the training gateway. The link is here at the top. You can search D365 and 11 available training courses will come up for you. You don't have to have a supervisor assign those. You can assign those to yourself. So I would heavily encourage you if you've not already. The second training site is the D365 user site that is on the city's intranet. That's where you can view 365 release notes when we upgrade. I typically do release notes to tell you what bugs have been fixed or what new features were added. And it's also where you can gain some help with 365. It has tech desk information and so forth, so that you can reach us. A third site is also on the city's intranet site. It's part of the D365 user site, but I broke it out separately. D365 training materials, so you can find training videos, presentations, some job aids, and then at the bottom, which is where today's presentation will go, on YouTube, there's a Dynamics user group that's just for the city of Columbus. The episodes of 10 minutes with D365 are a little dated at this point, right? But I think that overall they are still worth watching. And then any training events that we do. So we've done RFQs or invoices in the past. Obviously, the part 1 of this training is out there. Part 2 will be out there within the next couple of days. You can go out there. There are probably close to 20, I think, videos at this point in time that you can watch that all give, specific training for City of Columbus and D365. So I encourage you to use these training resources. You'll see them now at the bottom of Jody, Kyle, and I's email when we reply to you. So they're always there. And again, we just encourage you to use them. And so I'm done a little early, so we have some time for some questions. If anyone has them, please put them in the chat. And then I do have one bonus. So if you can answer this question, at what level is budget controlled here at the city? Maybe put your response into the chat, and we'll see who is correct. And Kyle, if you have any questions coming in, just let me know, and I'll try to answer those.
Do I get to answer the bonus?
No, you don't get to answer.
We do not have any questions at the moment.
No questions. Any answers?
No answers either. So, oh.
I see a D question mark. Question mark.
I think we're hitting on the right ones. Getting there.
Hitting on the right. Okay. So the answer is actually D. Budget control is controlled at the department, division, object class, fund, subfund, and project, if it's applicable, level. That is important for users to know, right? If you are getting a budget error when you're trying to, submit a PO or whatever document that it is, right? If you get a budget error, it is at this level. So I don't want to say we don't care about Section 3, Section 4, Section 5. Obviously, those are the levels that we budget to. But when it comes to whether D365 is going to let you submit a document or not, it is department, division, object class, fund, subfund, and project. So those are the areas that you would want to focus on if you're reaching out to a manager or maybe your budget analyst. One other thing is if you do get a budget error, you can go to budget analysis. There is actually, I'm almost positive it's when you pick your financial dimension set, we have numbers on them now. Number 12 is at the budget control level. So you can also do some analysis in budget analysis by picking financial dimensions at 12 and then running the inquiry so you can look at your budget information there, right? If there's no budget or if it's over budget or whatever the case might be, that is the level that we focus on.
Cheryl, and just another note there, if If you get, we talked last week about a couple budget warning messages that you can receive. One, if it's a GBR specific, and then two, if it gives you a ledger account. That ledger account that it shows you in the error message is that 12 dimension set at the department, division, object class, fund, subfund, project. That's what shows up when you get that error message.
That's a good point. Thank you. Any other questions?
So there has been, there are a couple questions in here about who to contact when there is a specific issue. So as it relates to anything D365, so if you have a question on processes about D365, you know, we would ask that you still file a tech desk ticket. If you have questions that may relate to you know, business process and how things operate in the city, I guess we'll have to talk maybe amongst the office. Michelle just said that there is a link to AO contacts on the city auditor's intranet site. So that's going to be your best starting point. But we will discuss that and maybe have a little follow-up as well.
All right. And so we do have plans to offer 365 training like this a little bit more often than we were able to last year. The next course that we're going to focus on is, I don't want to say a step back, but we're going to go more to the basics. We're going to go back to 365, and we're going to show you how to personalize, how to pick favorites for your menus, how to filter certain columns, how to add totals to the bottom of list grids, how to export to Excel, a bunch of things like that. So that training is coming. How do you shortcut within 365? Things that could help make your life a little easier, right? If you want to put certain things in a grid and keep them there and save them there so that they're there every time, but maybe you're struggling with that a little, we're going to go back and kind of show all of those types of features. And then there have been additionals added. Those come out in the release notes. So if you're reading those, you see those. If you've not had an opportunity to do that, though, there may be features that you don't know exist yet. So that's what we're going to focus our efforts on next time. If you have additional ideas for training that you'd like to see in the future, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I will certainly review that and see what we can do. So Kyle, if there's no more questions, I think we'll give everybody 10 minutes of their day back.
Yeah, I think that is, that's good. There was another specific question, but another one I've made a note of and we can address offline.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks everybody for your time today.